All right, we're just giving everyone a moment to get in from the waiting room. Welcome. Just give it another moment. I see people still hopping on. All right. I think it's time to get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second annual New Year Wellness Series, backed by popular demand and packed with meaningful guidance on spiritual, relational, emotional, nutritional, physical, and mental wellness. I'm Sarah Green, the wellness consultant at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at FAU Medicine. Integrative health is a holistic, patient-focused approach to healthcare and wellness. At the Marcus Institute, our physicians treat the whole person by examining everything that makes up a patient's health, including factors that can lead to disease, affect nutrition, exercise, and stress. Ultimately, patients and physicians are partners in healing and wellness. The Marcus Institute is pleased to co-sponsor this series with our friends at the Robin Rubin Center for Happiness and Life Enhancement. The center is housed in the Sandler School of Social Work within the College of Social Work and Criminal Justice at FAU. They offer weekly online meditation sessions, bi-monthly in-person yoga classes, and monthly wellness workshops. All of their offerings are free of charge and open to everyone, students, faculty, staff, friends, and family. We're posting links in the chat now and invite you to learn more about the Marcus Institute and the Robin Rubin Center and make plans to join us again in the near future. It is my honor to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Tatiana Pestana earned a Master of Public Health and received her MD from Albany Medical College. She completed residencies in internal medicine and pediatrics at Tulane University. To complement her medical training, Dr. Pestana received a culinary medicine certification from the Tulane University Goldring Center for Culinary Medicine to provide personalized nutrition and practical dietary advice. Dr. Pestana employs a holistic and preventive approach to care, counseling patients on healthy nutrition and lifestyle changes. With a focus on preventing obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease, she provides patients with concrete tools to achieve optimal nutritional health. Please enjoy this educational and engaging presentation. Take it away, Dr. Pestana.
Thank you, Sarah, for the lovely introduction. So I'm going to share my screen and just make sure everyone can see. Okay. So today we are going to be talking about the anti-inflammatory diet. And just a word of warning before we start. Inflammation and immunity are a complex web of interactive processes, and I'm not going to get into all the details here, but I will explain some complicated pathways, so keep your ears peeled, and I'll gloss over others for the sake of time. And lastly, just keep in mind that this type of diet may not be appropriate for all patients. People who have allergies or intolerances to some of these foods may not be able to do this. So first, let's define inflammation. Inflammation is the body's response to an offending process like an infection or an injury, malfunctioning cells like cancer cells, and toxins. It's an essential part of the body's normal protective mechanisms. So when there's an insult, the body sends out immune cells, plasma proteins, chemical mediators to stimulate more attention to that area. And the purpose of this process is to remove that offending agent so that healing can begin and the body can go back to health. Now, there are two types of inflammation. And normally when we're thinking about inflammation, we're thinking about the acute kind, the kind that is like the infection, the redness, the hotness, the swelling, everything that makes us hurt. But what I'm talking about today is chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation is progressive and it's below the level of our pain threshold, so it can go unchecked for years without us even realizing it. Off to the right, you're just seeing some cells that are responsible for some of those inflammatory processes. So these are some markers and mediators of inflammation in our body. And I highlighted the first two, the C-reactive protein and the sedimentation rate, because sometimes these could be checked by your doctor when they're evaluating you for certain health conditions. The others we don't usually check. They're just stepping stones in a lot of the inflammatory cascades and activities that are going on in our body. And I just listed them here because in a few slides, I'm going to be showing them as major players in those inflammatory processes, and I didn't want them to seem foreign to you. So why do we want to stop inflammation? Well, the short answer is we don't. Inflammation is necessary for healing, and the ability to create immunity to infectious diseases. So we want to be able to heal that cut. We want to have immunity to things like chickenpox. What we do want is to reduce that excessive and chronic low-level inflammation, because chronic inflammation is essentially a vicious cycle of inadequate healing, constantly calling on those cells and chemicals that I spoke about needed to complete the process of healing. And this ends up leading to cell damage that causes a lot of health problems. In fact, inflammation is a major contributing factor in 7 out of the 10 of the leading causes of death in the US, according to the CDC. And that includes heart disease, cancer, COVID-19, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, lower respiratory tract diseases like COPD and emphysema, asthma, strokes, diabetes, and Alzheimer's disease. But there are also a lot of lifestyle factors that can increase inflammation in our body, like too much alcohol, too much stress, exercising too much. And when I say too much, I mean maximum intensity without recovery, or it could be the opposite. Maybe that person exercises too little. And then, of course, having a personal history of smoking or exposure to cigarette smoke, or pollution, or other toxins like asbestos or industrial dyes or chemicals. And then there are the two biggies for today's lecture, eating the standard American diet or having a high body mass index that falls in the range of obesity. So the BMI is a calculation related to our height and our weight. And we can use this measurement to categorize patients into healthy, overweight, or obese weight range. Now, it's not a perfect measurement for everyone, but it is helpful when we're talking about statistical analysis, and we can use it as a way to track weight trends over time. And a healthy weight range is between 18.5 and 25. Overweight is 25 to 30, and above 30 is obese. And that's important because obesity has become one of the most common health problems in the US over the last 40 years. In 1985, less than 14% of the US's adult population was above a BMI of 30. But in the year 2000, we were at about 30%, and in 2018, we were above 42%. Obesity in and of itself has been shown to be an inflammatory state, but the diet that led to this increase in our weights over time is also part of the problem. So this is the standard American diet. And now I think it seems a little extreme just to get your attention, but in general, the standard American diet is high in animal fats, specifically saturated fats and omega-6 fatty acids, which we're going to talk about in a second. It's high in simple carbohydrates, which means sugars or refined carbs. So all of our white things like white bread, white rice, white pasta, baked goods, juices, sodas, and other sweetened beverages. It's also high in processed foods and preservatives like prepackaged snacks and chips. It's high in salt content, reference the same foods, and then it tends to be low in fiber and plant-based foods. And studies have shown that when we eat foods that are like this, it increases our risk for a lot of different health problems, like high blood pressure, high cholesterol and heart attacks, obesity, diabetes, cancers, and dementia. So how exactly do foods cause inflammation? Well, there's actually quite a few ways, but we're going to focus on 5 in today's talk, and we're going to start with omega-6 fatty acids. As I mentioned before, The standard American diet is very high in saturated fats and some fats called omega-6 fatty acids. Saturated fats are the things that are solid at room temperature. So think, the white fat on your red meat, the skin on your chicken, fat on pork chops, things like that. And omega-6 fatty acids can come from sunflower seeds, safflower, soy, sesame, corn oils, and other foods. Omega-6 fatty acids are essential, which means that our body can't make them, so we do need to consume them in certain amounts. And ideally for our health, the ratio that we should be taking in omega-6 to omega-3s is about 4:1 or less. And when we do this, our body can really handle it accordingly. But because foods in the standard American diet contain such a high volume of these types of fats, it becomes too much for our body to process, and these fats get funneled down a pathway known as the arachidonic acid pathway. And this pathway is responsible for the creation of molecules that cause pain, clotting, recruitment of immune cells, and leading to that inflammatory response that we're talking about. As you can see, the omega-6 fatty acids, like things from corn oil, meats, eggs, they all move down that red pathway towards those inflammatory molecules versus the omega-3 fatty acids on the other sides coming from other sources. So next, we're going to talk about advanced glycation end products, or AGEs, because this is actually one of the most common ways that many of our foods can cause harm in our body. AGEs are proteins or fats in our food that can be modified in a potentially harmful way when they're combined with a sugar. And this reaction can occur either when we're cooking or it can happen in our body. So when we're eating foods like red meat, fried chicken, cream cheese, oils, nuts, and they're cooked in ways like grilling, sauteing, toasting, or frying, that browning that we see on the outside of our food, or the Maillard reaction, if we're talking like a chef, it leads to the formation of AGEs. And normally, if we're not taking in too many of those AGEs, our body can take care of them. But when we take in too many AGEs, either through our foods or we create too many in our body because we have prediabetes or diabetes, meaning that we have free sugars floating around wanting to bind with stuff, those AGEs bind to a receptor that can produce something called a reactive oxygen species. Reactive oxygen species are bad actors, and our body can be damaged by them. So when the body senses those reactive oxygen species, it calls for those inflammatory chemicals, molecules, and cells to that area to kind of get rid of it. But this causes cell damage in the surrounding areas. So this new injury calls for even more cells and more chemicals to come and heal it. So there's this snowball of damage and repair that never completely ends, leading to abnormal cell function. And when we're talking about abnormal cell function in our blood vessels, that is what causes the vascular complications of diabetes, atherosclerosis, aging, and other degenerative problems. Something similar occurs in our brain with cognitive decline. Cognitive decline is the term that we use to refer to either just the forgetfulness that comes with aging, or it could range to something as bad as the dementia associated with things like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and cerebrovascular dementia. Cerebrovascular dementia is the cognitive decline that is associated with having high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and diabetes, or a combination of those things. So when it comes to AGEs and cognitive decline, some studies have shown that a higher level of AGEs in our circulation is associated with more transport of abnormal proteins, like things causing Alzheimer's disease, into the brain cells, and it actually causes a faster rate of cognitive decline. So this again leads to that vicious cycle of cell damage and repair that leads to further health problems. So let's move on to free radicals. Now, these were the types of molecules I was referring to when I mentioned reactive oxygen species. And remember, they're bad actors. So free radicals are actually normally produced in our body when we're turning food into energy or when we exercise, but they're also produced in our body with exposure to pollution, radiation, cigarette smoke, and sunlight. In other words, when we are exposed to toxins. Free radicals and reactive oxygen species, which are basically just free radicals with an oxygen molecule, are unstable and they have something called an unpaired electron. And these free radicals are always looking for something to steal electrons from, so it can pair its lonely electron. When they bind to molecules that they shouldn't, and they steal electrons from those things, they damage the molecule or the cell. And that leads to something called oxidative stress. Oxidative stress actually damages DNA. It damages the proteins and fats in the cells, and it can have dramatic effects on that cell's function and structure. And reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress in particular are involved in the development of inflammatory diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, cardiac and vascular diseases, and cancer. So let's move on to toxic exposures. And let's take red meat as an example. Now, we don't normally think of red meat as a toxin, and we shouldn't if we're not eating that much of it. But when we eat an excess of red meat in products like things like beef, goat, lamb, sausage, and things like that, we're taking in an excess of something called heme iron. Heme iron is what makes red meat red. And it's also how we get some of the iron that we need to make our blood cells. But dietary heme is absorbed mostly in our small intestine. If we eat too much red or processed meats, then there aren't enough enzymes to break them down and take that iron to where it's needed. So iron and free heme accumulate downstream in the large intestine where it's toxic. And this results in the production of more reactive oxygen species that damage the DNA in your large intestine and can cause gene mutations that lead to colon cancer. Processed meats cause harm because of their heme content, but also through other mechanisms. Processed meats are things like smoked or cured meats like hot dogs, bacon, salami, bologna, pepperoni, or even just a common cold cut. So if we're thinking of pepperoni in general, pepperoni not only has heme because it's red, but it also has nitrates. And nitrates are an additive used to preserve foods and prolong their shelf life. When you combine a heme and a nitrate, they form something called an N-nitroso compound, which is carcinogenic. It causes cancer. On top of that, when the processed meat actually comes in contact with our gastric juices, it creates a compound that creates more free radicals, but it makes two chemicals that can bind and mutate DNA. Those chemicals create mutations in DNA that not only kill normal cells, but they increase the strength and the growth of the precancerous mutated cells. So it creates polyps and allows those polyps to grow. Finally, heme accumulation can cause a change in our microbiome or the intestinal bacterial populations that we normally have. And in mice models, changes in the microbiome can also cause abnormal cell growth. So that brings us finally to dysbiosis. Dysbiosis is the imbalance of the types of bacteria that normally live in our gut, and that's called the microbiome. The microbiome consists of almost 40 trillion organisms making up almost 4 pounds of our body weight. And science is just starting to understand how important these organisms are to the rest of our body's health. Our microbiome consists of about 1,000 different species of bacteria, but 90% of them are only just a few families. So when we have dysbiosis, it means that we either have a loss of beneficial organisms in our gut, growth of possibly harmful organisms, or reduced diversity of the organisms, or it could be a combination of all three of these. And there are a lot of health problems that have been shown to be associated with dysbiosis, like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, cancer, obesity, irritable bowel syndrome, high cholesterol, prediabetes and diabetes, and psychological disorders. This cartoon is kind of complicated, but it basically is looking at the inflammation associated with processed foods and their additives. So things like artificial coloring, sweeteners, and preservatives, and how it affects our microbiome, increasing our risk for irritable bowel syndrome. Changes in the microbiome not only create symptoms for patients like gas and bloating, diarrhea, constipation, but it can also be associated with microscopic changes like reducing our intestinal lining thickness, which then affects the way we can absorb nutrients. It can also increase the permeability of our intestines. In other words, it makes it more porous, and then it allows molecules that shouldn't escape the gut escape, and that's no good either. And then there's the low-grade intestinal inflammation that's associated with those things themselves, which can also lead to systemic health issues. So if too many omega-6s, AGEs, free radicals, toxic exposures, and dysbiosis are some of the major players in increasing inflammation in our body, then what does the anti-inflammatory diet aim to do? Well, it's trying to reduce a lot of the foods that are contributing to that inflammatory process. And it tries to counteract the inflammation that's there with nutrients that can decrease the amount of circulating free radicals and reactive oxygen species and reduce that inflammatory response. It also provides the nutrients that our body needs to complete cellular processes. Because when we eat the standard American diet, it may be yummy and it may be filling, but even though it's high in calories, it is so low in nutrients, chemicals, and other things that our cells just don't have the tools they need to do the jobs they need to do. So as you can see here, the anti-inflammatory diet is kind of opposite of the standard American diet. It's higher in protein and lower in carbs and fat. It's low calorie. It's low in processed foods. It's low in land animal proteins and fat, and it's high in plant-based foods and high nutrient content. So this is just a head-to-head of the standard American diet to anti-inflammatory diet. We're going to take another look at this in just a moment. So to counteract inflammation, we're looking for foods that contain a lot of these components. They should contain fiber, omega-3 fatty acids, vitamins, antioxidants, polyphenols, and have a low calorie content. So if we're talking about fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and seafood, they contain a lot of those elements. So let's start with fiber. How does fiber reduce inflammation? And it does that in two major ways. Fiber decreases inflammation by helping to control our weight. Higher weight is associated with an increased number and size of fat cells. Fat cells that have too many macronutrients or just calories increase their production of inflammatory mediators. So the more fat cells we have, the more inflammatory mediators we have, the more inflammatory mediators we have, the more health problems we're at risk for. So fiber helps to reduce our calorie intake by filling us up or making us feel full on less food so we can help to maintain that healthy weight. And when we decrease our body weight into that healthy weight range, it reduces inflammation that is associated with obesity itself. Fiber also feeds that beneficial bacteria that lives in our gut, which then allows them to be healthier. And a healthy microbiome helps a variety of different things that happen in our body, including elimination of fats, toxins, and of course, other wastes. And then it also helps us to regulate our bowel transit. In other words, it helps us go to the bathroom easier and more regularly. So let's talk more about antioxidants. We hear a lot about antioxidants in food, skincare, and supplements, but what does that mean? An antioxidant is a substance that protects our cells from the damage caused by those free radicals, those bad actors, because it neutralizes free radicals by giving up one of its own electrons. So antioxidants are like a shield. When they donate their electrons, those free radicals or reactive oxygen species can't cause damage by stealing electrons from places they shouldn't, so there's less cell damage. So where do we get antioxidants? Vitamin C, vitamin E, copper, zinc, selenium, beta-carotene, lycopene, lutein, xanthine, and polyphenols. A lot of substances you already recognize. They're in our vitamins, our minerals, and then there are some pigments that we get from brightly colored foods. We can also get a lot of these from multivitamins. But where do we get polyphenols? Polyphenols are a particular type of antioxidant. They're a chemical compound that's abundant in plants with a phenol group, and this is what a phenol group looks like. And we don't really know how polyphenols work, but what we do know is that they're beneficial because they target those free radicals and reactive oxygen species to reduce oxidative stress and inflammation. So different polyphenols can decrease the production of inflammatory stepping stones. So in other words, they don't let it be created, but others can just reduce histamine. So histamine is the chemical that causes allergic reactions, the thing that makes us feel itchy and swollen. And then others block receptors that inflammatory mediators would bind to. So it runs defense. It basically just fills up those holes so that the inflammatory markers can't bind. Polyphenols increase vessel relaxation, so that lowers blood pressure. It decreases risk of stroke, and it can decrease our risk of metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is basically just obesity, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and high sugars all in one place that increase our risk for cardiovascular disease in a synergistic way. There are many kinds of polyphenols, and I haven't listed them all here, but we can find them basically in whole plant-based foods. There is some overlap in a lot of the types of polyphenols that can be seen in different foods, but I just want to bring your attention to the flavonoids on the left-hand side of the screen and the color-coded types of foods found in that group. These colors represent the colors of the foods where we can find these types of polyphenols. So if you're trying to get more anti-inflammatory foods in your diet, a good way to increase polyphenols on a daily basis is to eat the rainbow. Each day, you just count how many of these colorful fruits, vegetables, and legumes you're getting, trying to make sure that you're getting at least 1 to 2 servings of each color on a daily basis. So here are some of the colorful and delicious foods that contain antioxidants and polyphenols: raspberries, spinach, basically just your beautiful vegetables. Let's move on to omega-3s. So omega-3 fatty acids are essential, like I mentioned before, meaning our body can't make them, so that we have to obtain them from our foods. And they normally come from plant or animal sources. Usually the animal sources are fish and seafood, including oysters and shellfish, and plant sources are nuts, seeds, beans, and certain oils. Here are some examples of seafoods and plant-based foods that contain a lot of omega-3s. And just notice that land animals are not on this list of foods containing a significant amount. And although there are some omega-3 fatty acids found in land animal products, they're really not a significant source. And even though a lot of people feel like chicken is much healthier for us than beef, its omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and remember what we want is 4 to 1, is actually quite high. You can see it's 15 or 17 to 1, depending on if you're eating white or dark meat. Also, eggs are now getting a lot of press being high in omega-3s, but when we look at eggs, there's really not a statistically significant increase in omega-3 fatty acids unless you're looking at eggs from pastured hens. Pastured hen eggs do have 3 times the amount of omega-3 fatty acids, but cage-free and free-range, even though they're a whole lot more expensive, don't have a significantly higher level of omega-3s compared to commercially raised eggs. So when we take in foods that have a higher omega-3 fatty acid content, omega-3s shunt down that green pathway, leading to mediators that are less inflammatory. Omega-3 fatty acids inhibit an enzyme called COX, which then which can shunt down the inflammatory pathway that we discussed earlier. So when we take in foods that are higher in omega-3 fatty acids, they function similarly to an aspirin, blocking pain. So does that mean then that we should be getting omega-3 fatty acids from supplements? Well, maybe, but not necessarily. Omega-3 fatty acids are one of the most widely purchased supplements in the US. And normally it comes from fish oil, krill oil, or marine algae, but there are vegan sources as well. And there is strong evidence for the prevention of cardiovascular disease when we get omega-3s through our diet, when we're eating lots of fish and seafood. But there's actually unclear benefit when we're taking low dose over-the-counter supplements. And most people are taking a lower than recommended dose of their over-the-counters. The prescribed kinds of omega-3s like Lovasa and Visipa and things like that, there is actually quite strong evidence for the benefits in those. But it's important to keep in mind that when we're buying over-the-counter omega-3 fatty acids, there is no FDA regulation of these dietary supplements. So you do have to be careful that the amount of EPA and DHA, which are the omega-3s, that what is listed is actually in there. And contamination can also be an issue with some of these supplements. So definitely, if you're going to do an omega-3 fatty acid, make sure you're purchasing your supplements from a reputable manufacturer and that it is USP and GMP certified. So putting all these factors together, most non-starchy vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, which are nuts, seeds, and beans, and seafood, they're all high in vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and low in calories. But the group of foods that packs the most punch in checking all of the boxes for reducing inflammation are cruciferous vegetables. So cruciferous vegetables are named for the 4 petals of their leaves looking like a cross. And as you can see, these vegetables are high in antioxidant vitamins, minerals, pigments, and phytochemicals. And they're also high in both soluble and insoluble fiber, but they're low in calories. So they kind of do it all. And here are some of the examples of the beautiful cruciferous vegetables that you can work into your soups, salads, side dishes, and condiments. Wasabi's even in there. So if you like spicy, that's great. And keep in mind that even though a lot of these foods become superfoods advertised in the media, once the media declares something a superfood, it oftentimes becomes very expensive. And it's really not necessary for these foods to be fresh to be anti-inflammatory. So frozen, dried, and rinse canned food options of these types of foods can be options when cost is a limiting factor. So people often ask if the anti-inflammatory diet is gluten-free and dairy-free. And oftentimes it is, but it's not universal in those recommendations. And it tends to be popular, opinion-based, or individually based. So gluten, which is the protein that's found in wheat-containing products, is of course inflammatory and very harmful for patients who have celiac disease. But celiac disease only accounts for about 1% of the population. There are patients who have something called non-celiac gluten sensitivity or wheat sensitivity, or they have irritable bowel syndrome, and those patients also benefit from staying gluten-free. And sometimes if we have patients who are having a lot of GI symptoms, or they just don't feel quite right, or they have fatigue, we will, as part of an elimination diet, take out gluten to see if it could be one of the contributors to that patient's symptoms. But there isn't enough evidence to support that all patients without these health problems should be following a completely gluten-free diet. As a matter of fact, consuming a moderate amount of whole grains can have benefits. As you could see with those flavonoids a few slides back, they have a lot of omega-3 fatty acids and can be found in whole grains and cereals. Dairy has also been excluded from the anti-inflammatory diet by some. And while there is some evidence that dairy can worsen acne, it can be linked to certain cancers and cardiovascular disease. There are actually studies that show fermented dairy can have cardiovascular benefits. So I'm talking yogurt and kefir and things like that. So as of now, there isn't enough evidence to recommend against all dairy. There is definitely more we need to learn about dairy and gluten and its relationship to our health. So let's take another look at that standard American diet versus the anti-inflammatory diet. Lower in carbs, higher in protein, lower in fat, and then the types of fats are healthier. It's lower in calorie, higher in whole foods, higher in all of these good things, including complex carbohydrates and plant-based foods. So what does the anti-inflammatory diet boil down to? When you break it down, it looks a whole lot like the Mediterranean diet with less meat and dairy and adding in some herbal infusions. And let's not forget that when we're following an anti-inflammatory diet, it's not just diet that reduces inflammation. There are other things in our life that increase inflammation. So unchecked stress on our mind and body cause inflammation. So if we're doing things like meditation, exercise, getting adequate sleep, and trying to maintain stress reduction, treating our bodies and minds with care helps to reduce inflammation as well. So what can we use this diet for? Now, theoretically, we can use this diet for all of these health problems, but we don't have a lot of studies to support the anti-inflammatory diet very specifically. A lot of what we know about the anti-inflammatory diet is based on Mediterranean diet research. So there aren't a lot of studies that definitively show those benefits. And the reason for that is pretty multifold. I mean, people are pretty unpredictable. We don't eat the same things all the time. And sometimes culturally, we may not like certain things. As a matter of fact, some of the studies that I looked at in preparation for this talk, they lost up to 1/3 of their study subjects because they could not comply with the dietary restrictions. The other thing is, when we change our diet, it doesn't happen overnight. We don't change our diet and have those medical benefits tomorrow. And we don't oftentimes hold people in labs for years and years on end. We lose people to follow up when we're doing studies. So it can be difficult to do long-term studies for these types of diets. Then also, sometimes these diets are not just about what we eat. So if you start eating differently, maybe you feel better, maybe you start exercising, maybe you sleep better. And it's hard to quantify how much of that benefit came from just the diet or all of the other things that occurred with relationship to changes in diet and health. And then none of the studies out there looking at the anti-inflammatory diet can tell us how much of these foods we should be eating and how much benefit we should expect from eating any one of those things. So it does get very difficult to prove cause and effect. So I think we are running out of time. So I did list a whole bunch of studies that look at decrease in inflammatory markers and decrease in weight following the anti-inflammatory diet or the Mediterranean diet. This study showed an increase in survival and a decrease in cancer recurrence in breast cancer patients. This showed a significant reduction in stress markers after 12 weeks on the Mediterranean diet. This is also reduction in stress markers. And this study showed a lower incidence of high complexity cardiovascular lesions. And if a patient had a heart attack and did not follow something like the Mediterranean diet or anti-inflammatory diet, they had a lower chance of return of normal blood flow to the damaged part of the heart after their treatment. So the anti-inflammatory diet is not proven, but we do know that the inflammatory effects of the way we eat now, those are well proven. So we just need more research to look at this a little bit further, but I think we have a lot of evidence to continue to recommend this and try and improve our own diets and our clients' diets. And I do have some recipes if anyone is interested. This is some shrimp and arugula, some avocado egg salad with citrus green beans, some chia coconut pudding, and balsamic braised Brussels sprouts. And that's it. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Pestana. That was fascinating. I always learn something new every time I listen to you. Ladies and gentlemen, before we jump into questions, we are going to drop a survey link in the chat box. If you can please just take a quick moment to fill that out. That allows us to continue to offer this programming to you and know what it is that you're interested in learning about. So please take a moment to do that. I also want to share that I do have Dr. Pestana's email address. I will be dropping that in the chat box if you have questions that we aren't able to get to in this session. I have a question myself, but I'm going to wait and allow the audience to ask. And if there's time, I can ask you at the end. So for the sake of time, either raise a hand on Zoom or turn your camera on and you can unmute to ask a question. You want to be mindful of the time. Questions? Okay, here's a question. Do you provide ongoing trainings?
So yes, when I'm seeing a patient in my office, I do tend to see them every 3 months, and we go over dietary changes. It is something that requires ongoing guidance and modifications. So yeah.
They're asking to see the recipes again.
Okay. Anyone in particular?
Karina, anyone in particular? The pudding.
Okay, I got it there.
Will we be able to see the presentation? Ashley, do you want to share about that on YouTube?
Yep. So this has been live streamed to YouTube. So we can pull the YouTube link and send it out maybe with next week's reminder email, just so that folks aren't getting multiple emails for the series. So keep an eye out for the reminder email for next week, and we'll include the YouTube link in there for this week's presentation.
Another question. Can you clarify about whether broccoli causes problems because it makes people gassy?
So a lot of times we have increased gas when we start eating foods that are higher in fiber. There are some patients who have irritable bowel syndrome, and they do tend to get more gas with foods like broccoli, garlic, onions, things like that. It really depends on that person. If we try and run a marathon in terms of eating a lot of fiber from one day to the next, we of course are going to get an excessive amount of gas if we go from eating very little fiber to eating quite a bit of fiber. Gas in and of itself is not harmful, and there are ways that we can kind of build up to eating those things on a regular basis and decreasing the amount of gas that we produce. But it just kind of depends on the person.
Okay. Also, could you comment on the amount of lead and cadmium in dark chocolates?
I cannot actually. There is a lot of environmental toxins in almost everything. I'm not aware specifically in dark chocolate, but I do try to take a lot of the contamination reports with a grain of salt. I do try and look up stuff on the Environmental Working Group website to make sure that we are not excessively limiting ourselves because of potential contamination of, I can think of any food that we eat on any regular basis has reports of contamination. If we were to be mindful of every single one of those, we would never be able to eat anything.
And I wanted to share, Dr. Pestana, there's Environmental Working Group has the Dirty Dozen and the Dirty Clean list that changes. And I have a magnet that I keep on my refrigerator to remind myself before I go food shopping. So that's a great resource. You can check the Environmental Working Group, and that changes just based on environmental factors. There's a question here about the role of chicken as a protein source. I don't know, it wasn't asked specifically about the omega ratio, but if you want to comment on that.
Well, of course, everyone has their preferred protein sources. If we can try and fit in less chicken and more seafood, if a patient does not have allergies, then that is preferable. We want to be trying to eat at least 2 times a week seafood or or fish, and try and reduce poultry to at least, twice a week. If you are doing poultry, it's always a better idea to try and do organic if you can. But if that's not an option, then trying to reduce poultry in general might be a better way to go. And trying to get our protein from beans, from soy, but not too much soy, and trying to find protein in different areas.
Okay, great. I know there are lots of other questions. This is a great topic, so much to learn about. I am going to end the Q&A for the sake of time. I want to be punctual and mindful. However, I did drop Dr. Pestana's email in the chat box. Remember that Dr. Pestana is a practicing physician, and so she will respond to those emails at her soonest convenience. And I want to thank you all for being here, especially Dr. Pestana. We hope that you'll make plans to join us next week. Same link, same date, and same time. Next Wednesday at noon, when we will talk with Christy Cagiani, registered licensed dietitian and nutritionist, about the food and mood connection. So we will continue this nutritional conversation in a different way about the food and mood connection. Until then, be well and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all for joining us.